Well, greetings, everyone. I'm Henry Neufeld of Energion Publications, and I'm talking this afternoon with Dr. Timothy Dwyer, who's somewhat of an expert on Paul. He has written a book which is published by Energion Publications, will be available next week, titled The Gospel in Colossians. And this is one of our sequence of interviews on who was Paul. So we'll be asking the same 10 questions. If you're seeing this on my website, you'll be seeing several people who have answered these questions before, and Dr. Dwyer will be answering those same 10 questions today. So, Tim, welcome.
Welcome. Good afternoon.
Okay, let's just get right into this and see if we can get some interesting answers. I recommend these regularly as I'm teaching. I do a half an hour study every Wednesday night on an indefinite length project on perspectives on Paul. And so I'll be recommending this to people to get an understanding, how is it that we come to understand Paul the Apostle, Paul as a person, as a missionary, etc., and his impact on Christianity, looking through his writings and so on. And so that's where these questions come from, is to help the listeners there get a better understanding of the background. So as we start out for that project, of course, this is a very important question. Which epistles do you regard as Pauline? Ephesians, Colossians, the pastorals, Hebrews. So if we could get an idea of what would you see as truly from Paul and how that would relate to understanding.
My take on it is basically Romans through Philemon. I think Hebrews is by a second generation Christian, Hebrews 2, 1 through 4, therefore not from Paul. The others, I think, are all from Paul in the sense that Luke Timothy Johnson's recently said that they are Paul's thoughts and Paul's words in different situations with different secretaries or different writers or different scribes. So the process of getting from Paul to paper to us is a complex one, but it is clearly, I think, Paul's thought in all of them. And I think a careful reader will see continuity in all of them if you're paying attention to especially the details, as well as diversity, but a clear continuity. So basically Romans through Philemon I regard as Paul.
Okay, just as a quick follow-up on that, so as you're doing a source, if you're using them as a historical source in understanding who Paul was, you would think a little bit about that more complex process, say with Colossians, Ephesians, or the pastorals. You'd give a little more, some attention to that.
So there was an author and historian named William Manchester that died a few years back, and after his death, someone took some notes and research he had done on Winston Churchill. He completed 2 large volumes on Churchill and was working on the third, but when he died, the third volume was not complete. So his notes and his thoughts were then brought together by another author / editor to complete volume 3. I think it's like that with the Apostle Paul, that whatever the situation before or after his death, his friends had listened to him, they'd heard him day after day, night after night in the workshop, traveling from one place to another, and they have his heart and his mind and his words, even potentially after his death.
Okay, that's excellent, and I think helps people in evaluating the sources. So our second question is this: how do you evaluate Acts as a historical source in answering the question, who is or who was Paul?
Yeah. A number of years ago, a scholar named Colin Hemer wrote on the historicity of Acts and really, I think, turned things in the field of Acts studies. He demonstrated as a good British historian how so much of Acts is corroborated by inscriptions and by coins, etc. So there's a high sense of the historicity of the book of Acts. 6 volumes were done by Erdmans on that topic, and Craig Keener recently. So mammoth studies on Acts in recent years have given a high sense of the historicity of Acts. It's telling the story of the spread of the gospel, including Paul, but in a slightly different way than Paul talks about himself in the letters.
Okay. So let's get on with our third question, which lets you start evaluating who Paul was. From your reading of Paul, if you were asked to introduce him as the next speaker at a conference, what might your introduction be?
I would say this: Paul is the combination of a high school principal, as I once heard someone say, someone who has to break up a fight in a hallway, someone has to fill in shop class, someone who has to handle a call from an irate parent and deal with a board with a budget that night. He's someone busy and multitasking his whole life, and someone who's a little bit like a guy I know named Mono that can fix the air conditioning in my house and yet has a kind of a sterling character. He's a working man, and yet he's a little bit like John Wesley or Francis Asbury that went from place to place and founded gospel communities. So Paul is a kind of a combination of a working man, a tent maker, and someone with maybe the most brilliant mind we've ever seen. F.F. Bruce once said that he regards Paul as the greatest man to have ever written in Greek. That's an incredible accolade. That's saying beyond Homer, beyond Thucydides. But then Bruce goes on to say, if someone were to call him the greatest writer of all time, I would not disagree with that.
And some of us would consider F.F. Bruce to be fairly high on the list himself.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so moving on. If a friend of yours was considering going on a mission trip with Paul, and obviously in history a number of people had the chance to make that decision, what would your advice be? Go with him? Maybe plan a different journey?
Be prepared to stomach difficulties along the way. Be prepared to maybe swim for it if you're and be prepared perhaps to be thrown in prison before the day is over. When Paul went to towns, there was a revival or there was a riot, one of the two. So be ready for both.
Let's move forward then. What do you think modern interpreters most commonly misunderstand about Paul?
Paul was not a person in an ivory tower in an academic setting taking a sabbatical at Princeton. He was someone who was sweating in a workshop, who had the scriptures where they should be in his mind and in his heart, and had such a passion for the gospel. So I think the biggest misunderstanding is that this is a working man working on his tents and his awning. He's not a scholar in an ivory tower.
Okay, and to continue then, we've already talked about using historical sources, but what would you think were Paul's primary theological sources? What formed him? And I'd like to suggest, as people have talked, how much is it his Jewish background, Greek reading, education, and philosophy, and his own visionary experiences, or anything else that you have?
I think Paul knew the scriptures by heart, especially Deuteronomy and Psalms and Isaiah, and could probably quote the entire books, just like in the ancient world, there were people that could quote Homer from beginning to end, the Iliad and the Odyssey. I think his Greco-Roman education was probably at what we would call the grammar school level, but he picked up things by osmosis, by listening to people in the streets, by hearing poets recite. So I don't think he had formal rhetorical training, but I think he kind of picked up things as he traveled around from city to city. So I would say kind of a strong education in the Torah and in the scriptures, and then Greco-Roman education, mostly by osmosis after a kind of a grammar school beginning.
Okay. Continuing again, what do you think Paul would say today to the American church in general?
He would say, don't think you can get people into a dark sanctuary, play rock and roll music, give them good coffee, and form them into Christ-like disciples. It takes a transformed heart, a vision of the greatness of Christ, and a strong commitment to discipleship and suffering. He'd say to the American church, stop making it so convenient for people to be Christians. Teach them The way of Christ is the way of the cross.
Okay. So I don't recall what your denomination is, but the next one I had was, what do you think people would say to those in your denomination or your tradition stream in particular?
My background is in the Church of God, Anderson, Indiana, which is a denomination which has kind of considered themselves to be a movement rather than a denomination. We've always said we have no creed but the Bible. So it's informed by some streams in pietism and some streams in Anabaptism and with some, Lutheran and Reformed elements. So that's less prominent. The key is we try to be a Bible people. And in our church, there's no formal membership. When you're part of the body of Christ, we say you're part of the true church. I think Paul and Paul's message says to our church, don't rely on entertainment or the latest ministerial trend. Have confidence that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation, like it says in the book of Romans. Have confidence in that and let the gospel do its work. Plant communities of faith. Maybe they're 10 or 20 people. Maybe they're house churches. Maybe they're looking different after COVID than before. But plant communities of faith and let the gospel do its own work. So I think he would caution us about reliance on the latest technique or the latest ministerial conference where we're told what the next trend is going to be. Have confidence in the gospel, he would say.
Okay. And we're going to move to a very somewhat different subject, although I would say, sounds to me like you would say the gospel should rule in any case. What do you think Paul would say to us about our political activities?
I think Paul in the scriptures is remarkably indifferent to what is going on in Rome with the emperor, with the Senate, etc. We, of course, have some emperors named in the New Testament, such as, for instance, Claudius in the book of Acts and Tiberius in the book of Luke. But in Paul's letters, he simply seems to be indifferent to whatever Rome decides. And he doesn't seem to really care very much if the emperor is Claudius or Nero or whoever it is. His job is to spread the gospel. In Romans 13, he wants the Christians, it seems like, to not make a lot of trouble. And that is the sense of that he doesn't expect them to be able to fix Roman society. So I think that Paul is like someone who is largely unconcerned about what's going on because he's got bigger fish to fry. He wants to bring people to see Christ. He wants to build up those in the faith, and he wants to get them to spread the gospel and then move on to plant another church in another place. So I don't think he would spend a lot of time in our day listening to Fox or listening to CNN or following the latest in Politico. I think he's got bigger fish to fry than the political situation in Rome and probably in our day.
Okay. Finally, I give you an opportunity to go wherever in the field you think is most important. Is address the most important topic you see about Paul that I haven't covered in the questions that I have. What would be something that I haven't talked about here that you would want to say about Paul to the viewers?
Yeah, I think I would talk about his house churches. If you back up to his ministry in spreading the gospel and planting churches, these were house churches, sometimes in tenements, the insulae, the 3 or 4 story buildings of 10 and 20 people. And as N.T. Wright and others have said, they're people with bad teeth and bad skin and bad hair. They're just trying to hang on in a society that doesn't care about them. But in these house churches, Paul is gathering together communities of the faithful. There's really nothing fancy about what they do. They sing to the Messiah, they pray, they take communion, they hear a message calling them to virtue and calling them to a godly life. But as we rethink the church after COVID, and a lot of people are trying to figure out, are we going to be doing more online things, more live streaming things? Will people ever actually come back to a physical building? It's worth asking if we built a kind of a superstructure that's bound to collapse sooner or later. The nice thing about the Apostle Paul's church is they're street level, they're mobile, they're flexible. If they have to move to someone else's house and gather there next week, they can do that. So the pure flexibility of the Pauline communities that these great letters are written to would be a kind of a lesson for our day. Maybe also a lesson for our day would be that the idea of bureaucratic structures and strategizing is less of an issue. Paul is very gospel-centered and very pragmatic in terms of he doesn't actually know what's going to happen when he goes to a town, but he does know that the power of the Lord will gather people unto the Savior. And he relies on that. He launches new leaders maybe before they're ready. I think of Paul as someone who is either your best friend or your worst enemy. Your best friend if you're being drawn to the Savior, growing in the faith. If you're trying to harm one of his believing communities, like in the letter to the Galatians or the Colossians, he can be a fierce enemy. But what he wants to do is build up these communities of faith that are flexible. And I think that's a message for us in a COVID and post-COVID era. Don't be trapped by the old wineskins. Let the new wine be in continual new wineskins, and maybe Paul's letters and ministry give us a little bit of a sense of that.
Okay, well, thank you for answering these questions. And for everyone, I've been talking to Dr. Timothy Dwyer. He's the author of a new book from Energion Publications, The Gospel in Colossians. And this has been one of our series of interviews on who was Paul. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.